Pastor Sean McDowell is here today. He's a gifted communicator with a passion for equipping the church, and in particular, young people. In fact, he's been a high school Bible teacher for many, many years to make the case for the Christian faith. He's an associate professor in the Christian Apologetics program at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. And Sean is the co-host for the Think Biblically podcast, if you want to write that down, Think Biblically podcast. It's one of the most popular podcasts on faith and culture engagement. Sean is listed among the top 100 apologists. He graduated summa cum laude from Talbot Theological Seminary with a double master's degree in theology and philosophy. I'm telling you, he's an expert. He earned a PhD in apologetics and worldview studies from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in 2014. I want to read some of the books, too, he's also written, so you can kind of be familiar in case they perk your interest. He's the author and co-author or editor of over 20 books, including Set Adrift, A Rebel's Manifesto, The Fate of the Apostles. By the way, I can give you this list later if you want. The Next Generation, so The Next Generation Will Know, and I've read that one. That's a fantastic one. Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Same-Sex Marriage, A Thoughtful Approach for God's Design for Marriage, Is God Just a Human Invention? And Understanding Intelligent Design. So he's written quite a bit. In April 2000, Sean married his high school sweetheart, which is probably more important, Stephanie, and they have 3 children and live in San Juan Capistrano, California, so not too far. And we can provide you his website and some of his resources as well to you, so don't be afraid to ask. But can we give a round of applause and a warm welcome to Sean McDowell?
Thank you. That was so sweet. I'll give you a hug. Thank you for that kind introduction. I do have to say, though, I noticed none of you were impressed when she said I was in the top 100 apologists. That's because you were thinking, I didn't even know there were 100 apologists. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. This is a treat. As a father of 3 kids, our topic tonight is one I've thought about, I've prayed about, had some successes, had moments of pain in my own life when things were not going like I hoped that they would. So we're going to open up the Word of God and look at it tonight. But in many ways, we're in the same boat together, trying to pass on our faith to the next generation. So I have a question for you as we start. If you're going to write down like a mission statement of your responsibility to your kids, what would it say? If you're going to write down what is most important to you about your kids, what would it say? So when teaching at a Christian school 21 years, I ask my students a lot of questions. Number one, to get them to think. By the way, Jesus told stories and he asked questions. But I'm also always curious what they would say. I want a glimpse into their belief system. And so one question I would ask students year after year was, more than anything else, what do your parents want for you? At a great Christian school an hour south of here. What do you think the top responses are? I'm curious. What do you think these high school students would say? My parents just want me to be happy, and someone just said it, successful, top 2. I want my kids to be happy and successful. But I would much rather have my kids be miserable failures in the eyes of the world and following Jesus than the reverse. So what does it look like to pass on our faith so our kids will embrace the faith we care about? Well, the start is to maybe reframe in our minds what our responsibility is. One of my favorite verses is Psalms 127:4. Says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. That means the greatest resource we have is not this amazing facilities that we have, not the money, not your home, nothing physical. The greatest resource, and obviously they're much more than this, to live and defend and proclaim the kingdom of God when you and I are gone, is our kids. This gets lost today, doesn't it? As our podcast that you mentioned, we do a weekly cultural update, and there was a story this week on how there's a U.S. company now that can screen embryos based on IQ. And for $50,000, they will guarantee that they will give you a child with at least 6 points higher of an IQ. This is the ideas of our culture, turning kids into products for something that we want. Rather than saying, what does God want us to do? What is our responsibility first and foremost as parents to kids that God has gifted us with? Well, there's a passage in the Old Testament we're going to look at. You're probably familiar with it. In fact, you could make the case that it is the central passage in the Old Testament. You could make that case. So, for example, when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law, what did he say? Love Lord God, your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. He cited this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6. In fact, Orthodox Jews will repeat this passage at least twice a day to their family and to their kids. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. If not, it'll be on the screen. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and if you can't find it, it's right after Deuteronomy chapter 5. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Deuteronomy. Good. When no one laughs at that, it makes me really nervous. So I'm really just testing you, my audience. Now, before we jump into what's specifically the Shema, a little context in this might help. So Moses is giving this speech to the people of Israel. He's been shepherding them for 4 decades before they enter into the promised land. So Deuteronomy is kind of a book of a final speech, since Moses can't go with them, of how they can have success in the land. And everything is about to change for them. You ever feel like right now, maybe with the elections and like things are just changing? Israel in this passage felt more like that than you and I may feel right now. They are no longer going to have a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day, directing them where to go. They're settling into the land. And here's what it writes in verse 2. Deuteronomy 6 verse 2 says, that you may fear the Lord your God, your son and your son's son, or your grandson, by keeping all the statutes and commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. This is in 6:2. Now notice what it says. It says, here's commandments not just for you, they're not just for your kids, but they're for all the generations coming after. That's a little bit of a different way to think about our responsibility, isn't it? We tend to think God gives me X number of years, then I'm gone. But when God started the nation of Israel, he says, I'm giving you commandments to pass on for every generation yet to come. And guess what? Your faithfulness or lack thereof is like a link in a chain to keep the faith going. When we look at it that way, that our faith can literally echo for generation after generation after generation. In fact, maybe because the new Gladiator is coming out in a couple weeks, I think of that speech that Russell Crowe gave. He's like, Ben, what you do today will like echo for eternity. There's something biblical about that, and I know I'm reading into it, but Gladiator's awesome, so excuse me, about how our faithfulness or lack thereof can echo for generations. So I've seen this in the life of my father. Some of you might recognize the name Josh McDowell. My dad has written over 150 books, spoken over 1,200 universities, kind of lived a modern Apostle Paul type life. He's 85 years old. I told him recently, he was over for dinner last night. I was like, man, Dad, you're old. When God said, let there be light, you flipped on the switch. He said, son, you have no idea. When I started ministry, the Dead Sea was only sick. His favorite line now is he goes, son, I never thought that 85 could feel like you're 40. I just can't remember what it feels like to be 40. Well, my dad admits how much God has used him, came from an incredibly broken background. Like his dad was a town drunk in a small town in Michigan. His older sister took her own life. My grandpa told my dad when he was a boy, he goes, you're a mistake. We didn't even want you. And for 7 years, my dad was severely sexually abused by someone who lived on their farm in Michigan. By all standards, my dad should be dead or he should be in prison. But God got a hold of his heart and transformed him. His 4 kids followed the Lord. His 11 grandkids follow the Lord. You start thinking about one life that God gets a hold of and how that literally can echo for generations. That's how Moses starts the nation of Israel. And that puts our responsibility a little differently, doesn't it? It's with that in the background that we jump into what's called the Shema. And this is what could be, you could make the case, this is the central or one of the most important passages in the Old Testament. So verse 4 says this, "Hear, O Israel," or some translations say, "Listen, Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one." Right away, here's a principle I think we can learn. It's this: to make God the Lord of your home. Make God the Lord of your home. Something is the Lord of your home. Something is the most important thing in your home. The question is not if, the question is what. Who or what is Lord of your home? Now, I'm guessing all of you have done the same thing that I did, that you maybe sent a text or sent a message, and then the moment you send it, you wish you could reach in cyberspace and have it back. Well, I was on a plane a number of years ago, landed in Orange County. One of my good friends was on the flight. I didn't know this. I was pulling my bag down. I looked in front. I'm like, oh, my goodness, we're on the same flight. So I texted him. I said, "Hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you." And I sent it to my mom, who was actually home alone at night reading. And I wish I had screenshotted it. She sent me back. She's like, "Hey, son, I think you got the wrong punk." I was like, shoot. Note to self, don't punk your mom, right? That's like rule number 1. Well, I tell you that because, gosh, it was 2010. I had my first public debate with a high school teacher at a school in Southern Orange County. You maybe remember this story. He was sued in a court of law because a kid recorded him under the desk. And he said really disparaging things against Christians. It was on the O'Reilly Factor at the time on Fox News. I was invited to debate him on God and morality at a local JC. And it's online if you want to watch it. But shortly before, I got an email from a girl asking me if she could interview me for the local paper about the debate. I was like, sure. Then the next day, I got an email from her. I'm reading it going, why are you sending me this? And then halfway through it, I thought, oh, she didn't mean to send this to me. So she came a day or two later to do the interview. When it was done, I said, "Hey, I'm not a counselor. You sent me this email. I read it before I realized you probably didn't mean for me to read it. But you're talking about depression and rebellion and anger. Like, do you want to talk about it?" She goes, "Sure. Yeah, all that's true." She goes, "In fact, last Sunday, I was actually in church with my parents. But what they don't know is I've completely rejected their God." As I just asked her questions and listened, what she essentially said was, she said, "I just can't believe in a loving, personal Heavenly Father when my own father has been such a workaholic." Do you see what Moses is saying? Make God Lord of your life. Make God Lord of your home. Because when we make God number 1, then other things start to fall in line. I sometimes do short social media videos with my kids. I have them ask me questions, and my daughter, she's a senior in high school, and she said, "Dad, what's the top advice you would give for me about finding a husband?" And what came to my mind, I said, you know what? She's beautiful, she's smart, she's going to Biola to play volleyball. I said, you're going to have plenty of people interested in you. You don't have to worry about that. But I want you to find someone that loves God even more that they love you. Because if someone loves God first, then they'll be able to love you rightly as someone made in the image of God that they're committed to. If we care about the next generation, the first thing we've got to ask is who or what is Lord of our lives and who or what is Lord of our home. Now, if you're not sure really what is, well, the best way is to pull out either your calendar or your checkbook. If you don't know what a checkbook is, ask somebody who's over 35. How we spend our time and how we spend our money reveals what is most important to us. That's why Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think the last way to gauge what's most important is when things go south and when things go bad. How do we respond? I was driving, this was pre-kids, so at least 20 plus years ago, up to the mountains outside of Fresno to speak at like an evangelistic conference for students up in the mountains. And I was driving with a pastor, I don't remember his name, just the two of us for like 5 hours up there. And somewhere on the 99 freeway, this loud screeching noise starts coming from his car. So we pull over. And I remember thinking, oh, we should have left earlier, should have got a rental car. Like all the problems are going through my mind. I'll never forget it. We pull over, no hesitation. He looks at me and he goes, let's pray. I see problems as opportunities to trust God. And I thought, wow, compared to him, I'm like a spiritual raisin. I was so convicted. I thought, wow, he really believes this. You see what Moses is saying? He's saying, make God Lord of your life. Make God Lord of your home. Then Moses goes on. In verse 5, it says, you shall love Lord God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. In other words, love God with what? This is the participatory part of the program. Love God with everything. Throw it up there for me. Love God with everything. Now, why does it matter that you and I love God? Why does that matter? Because kids tend to follow the passions of their parents. Kids tend to follow the passions of their parents or their grandparents or other significant figures in their life, like a teacher or an adult. But first off, parents. Kids tend to follow their passions. Now, you notice my first two principles out of Deuteronomy 6. We're talking about passing on the faith, but the first have to do with what? Us. We often look at our kids and go, I got to fix them. Here's all the things they're doing wrong. The Bible's like, actually, look in the mirror first. Make sure God's Lord of our life and make sure we're loving God. Because kids tend to follow what you and I get excited about, what we care about. My oldest son is a sophomore at Biola, and he plays basketball there. They have their first game tomorrow, so I'm pulling my younger son out of school. We're going to drive down to San Diego, watch him play. But when my son, it's amazing, he was 7 years old. We were driving to our Christian school, and in the car I said, hey, buddy, what do you love? He goes, well, in football, I love the Chargers. I said, okay, what else do you love? He said, well, in basketball, I love the Clippers. I said, what else do you love? He said, in baseball, I love the Red Sox, and I hate the Yankees. Now, it's funny he hates sport answers because in our family, we hate sports. Yeah, you don't believe that, nor should you. Why did he say he loved the Chargers? My wife's dad coached football for years. It's a family tradition. We follow. We enjoy rooting for the Chargers. Why did my son say he loved basketball? Both my wife and I were college point guards. And by the way, I know exactly what you're thinking. You don't look like a college basketball player, which proves only one thing. There must be a God. Never in my life has someone looked at me and said, you must have been a basketball player. The day that sincerely happens will make my day. None of you can do it because you heard me say this. Why did my son say he loves the Red Sox? My mom grew up in Boston. I mean, she loves the Red Sox. She was watching the World Series this year, obviously rooting for the Dodgers, not because she cares about the Dodgers, because she wanted the Yankees to lose. She's like drunk the Kool-Aid of the Red Sox. Well, I didn't have to sit my son down and say, hey, son, in this family, we love basketball. Hey, son, in this family, we root for the Chargers. Hey, son, we love the Red Sox. I didn't have to tell him that. He just saw his mom and his dad and his Grammy care about these things, sacrifice for these things, talk about these things, get excited about these things. And he picked it up and became important to him. Sometime after this, I don't remember how old he was, but not much older, I said, hey, buddy, if you could go to any sporting event with anybody, what would it be? And keep in mind, he played flag football and like basketball or sports. He paused and he goes, I think I'd go to a Red Sox game with Grammy. I said, really? Why? And I'll never forget his response. He said, because she just loves the Red Sox so much. So he graduated from high school 2 years ago, and my mom flew him to a game at Fenway in Boston to watch the Red Sox, get this, beat the Yankees. Do you see why Moses says, love Lord God with your heart and your soul and your mind, because our kids and the next generation are watching, and much more is caught than it is taught. So what do you love? What do you get excited about? What's important to you? And on the flip side, what breaks your heart? Because these things will tend to shape the hearts of the next generation. Moses goes on, verse 6, he says, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. These words I command you today shall be on your heart. Now, if I was going to give another talk and frame it like how to not pass on your faith to the next generation, basically my response would be, make the Christian faith about legalism. Make it about the rules, divorced from relationship or the reason for the rules. Given what I do, I get to have a lot of conversations with atheists, agnostics. If you recognize the name Michael Shermer, he lives in Pasadena, not far from here, one of the most recognizable skeptics in the world. 2 weeks ago, I had him on, and we debated 2 hours God and morality, and it was actually fun. I enjoyed it. But I hear a lot of people's stories, and over again, people who left the faith would say things like it was about the rules and it never made sense. Why? Legalism is basically the formula to turn a young person away from the faith. One of the most, I think, memorable and insightful things my father's ever said is this: rules without relationships leads to rebellion. That one is worth writing down. I don't write stuff down. I have photographic memory. I just don't have any film. Again, if you didn't get that, ask someone over 35. Rules without relationships leads to rebellion. Rules without relationships leads to rebellion. That's what Moses is talking about. He's saying, here's commandments. You got to follow them. There's truths we have to follow. But they're to be in our hearts and lived out in relationship. It's not about the rules. It's about loving God and loving other people. The rules give us guidelines, you might say. Well, oh wait, this might make sense, is Van Gogh, obviously one of the most famous artists of all time. A lot of people don't know this, but he grew up wanting to be a pastor. Couldn't become a pastor in his denomination. You had to master Greek in some fashion. He just couldn't do it. But he became a missionary. And by some accounts that we have, he was ministering to blue-collar folks. He'd give them the shirt off his back, shoes off his feet, just cared for people where they were. But then he came before the mission board to have his license renewed, and he was denied for 2 reasons. One, they said, Vincent, you're not a good enough preacher. Second, they said, your appearance is unbecoming of a minister of the gospel. Clearly, they hadn't read the story of John Baptist. Falls into a sort of depression for about 6 months. And then letters start cropping up. There's a lot of letters they have in the life of Van Gogh, which are pretty interesting, talking about wanting to be an artist. Well, I believe he only sold 1 painting in his life. The secular story is he left the faith, left the church, but I'm not sure that's the whole story. He obviously had some psychological and mental issues in his life, but it seems he continued to believe in God, but would use his art to critique the church. Now, I didn't put a picture in this, I should, but just Google it sometime. Van Gogh, the church. It's a painting of a church building with no doors. Isn't that interesting? Well, perhaps his most famous painting, A Starry Night. And I bought a version of this painted down in Tijuana. I actually was walking out of the market. It was actually Rosarito. I was walking out of the market and I stopped. I'm like, hey, mine's got a big white smudge march on the bush. And that guy goes, no problem, I fix it. Pulls out a Sharpie, to my Van Gogh. And he actually fixed it. So it's up in my office. I love that painting, but you know what Van Gogh is actually saying in this painting. Now, if you look at it, our eyes are drawn to the sky, right? It's active, it's vibrant, it's alive, because Van Gogh believes Psalms 19, where it talks about the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day by day they spew forth speech. Night by night they display his majesty. Nature's alive with God, but if you look in the valley, what's in the middle? The church. What do you notice about the church? The lights are off. God is alive in nature, but the church is dead. That's in part what Van Gogh is saying, and in part what Moses was talking about 3,000 years ago. This isn't about the rules. It's not about the commandments. God has truths for how we're supposed to live, but these are to be in our hearts and to be lived out in relationship with people. And then Moses actually gives us specific ways to do this. In verse 7, he writes this. I always feel like Marco Rubio every time I drink water. You remember that years ago, that awkward moment? Anyways, not that we haven't talked about politics enough over the last 27 years. Verse 7 says, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise." Now here's the principle, I think. It's to make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. Make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. Now, why is that so important? I would argue that in our secular culture, it's okay for the most part if you believe in God at your Christian school, at your church, in the privacy of your home. But your faith ought not leave there and affect the way you think about culture, or say government, or voting, or anything else in the public arena. Our faith should be kept privatized, is what our secular culture says. And yet Moses says, make God a natural part of the rhythm of everything that you do. Now, I think in churches, in families, in good Christian schools, without realizing it, we can foster what's called a sacred secular split, where we have our spiritual lives over here, but it doesn't affect our real life over here. So I'll give you an example. I went to Biola in the 90s. I teach full-time at Biola right now. And I remember we used to have a chapel at the end of the year where we would commission students going away on mission trips to like faraway places, to Africa, Australia, China, Texas. I can pick on it. I was born there. Now, imagine this. If you've been in Biola's gym, there's maybe 2,000 plus students, and they would have this commissioning, announcements, worship, message, chapel is done. And I remember thinking, why are we only having students stand who are going on mission trips? Why don't we have students stand who are going to work construction for the summer? Or going to work as an intern at a local business? Isn't that a mission field? Absolutely it is. But without realizing it, sometimes we can say, here's our spiritual things over here, and then here's the rest of our jobs over there. So you mentioned the podcast that I co-host. One of the reasons I did this is we call it Think Biblically. And the idea is think biblically about everything. That's been one of Biola's mottos. And I know you're doing this here at Foothills, trying to train students younger to think about doing this in everything that they do. But how to think biblically about math, about history, about science, about music, about art. That kind of non-compartmentalization is what Moses is talking about in our families. Help our kids see that faith applies to everything. That's what we mean by a biblical worldview. Now, why is this important? I've studied faith transmission for a couple decades plus. And there's an interesting study that came out. This is by a sociologist at the University of Notre Dame by the name of Christian Smith. And he wrote this in a book called Souls in Transition. And he made a point. He said this: kids develop religious beliefs like they do other beliefs. Throw the next slide up there for me, if you will. The way we develop religious beliefs is the same as in other areas. So there's not like a special way you learn to think about, say, theology that in general is different than how you think about politics or how you think about culture or how you think about some other issue. Now, why is this important? Think about something that's important to you. I don't know, maybe you like to play golf. Do you have a rule in your family that says we talk about golf Saturday mornings and Tuesday nights? No, if you like golf, when do you talk about it? All the time. And that's fine. But my question is, when do you talk about God? When do you talk about God? Because if you only talk about God, well, after, after church on Sunday, then we're given the message that God can be compartmentalized to that part of my life. So look, we just got out of a political season, and we're not going to talk politics, but I'll make a broader point that most kids tend to adopt the beliefs their parents have about politics, for the most part. I know there's exceptions. For the most part, they do. Now, how does this happen? Well, most parents don't sit down and say, hey, we're liberal or conservative. Here's what we think about tax policy. Here's what you should think about the war in Ukraine. Here's what you should think about inflation. Like, not that formally, but it just comes up as you're at the dinner table. It comes up while you're driving in the car. It comes up through the rhythm of life. And kids just learn how to see and think about the world. So if we only talk about God in those compartmentalized spaces, what we're saying without realizing it is God can be compartmentalized to that area and doesn't create a holistic worldview in the life of our kids. That's why making God a natural part of the rhythm of life helps kids think biblically about everything. Now let's look at the specifics Moses gives. He says, talk about them in the home. Talk about God in the home. Now, in many ways, he's talking about God over the family meal. Now, here's a picture of a family meal that officially has never happened in any family meal in the history of family meals. But I put it up there to make all of us feel guilty. Now, there was an interesting article in Newsweek a few years ago, and it was called The Magic of the Family Meal. And they talk about how the family meal was kind of coming back, and COVID in some ways forced people to slow down and actually eat together and talk and realize, oh, this is kind of important. Maybe we should keep doing this. One positive thing that came out of that craziness. But they said in this study, and I think it's been shown to be true in other areas, that kids who regularly dine with the folks, less likely to be involved in risky behavior, more likely to have success in school, be emotionally balanced, like all of these positive outcomes from regularly dining with the folks. And they said even on nights when the food is cheap and the talk is fast, they said it instills in kids a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of being seen and heard and being a part of something. In this article, they said there's something about a meal in which stories are told, jokes are laughed at, and get this, the wider world is viewed through the lens of the family's values. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's what Moses is talking about. He's saying talk about them when you're in the home. Now, I don't have formal devotionals with my kids. Some of you are like, what? Because my dad wrote like 3 family and teen devotionals. We didn't even use them in our family, believe it or not. We didn't. He wrote them for other people to use, to be completely honest with you. But one thing my parents would do, and I would do with my kids, is my dad was always engaging us in conversations about the Bible or issues of the day or asking us questions to talk about spiritual issues. So for us, I didn't sit down and formally have devotionals, but sometimes I'll share with my kids, hey, here's a prayer request that I had. Or, hey, I've been studying this. What do you guys think? Or this is going on in the culture. What do you think about it? And just engage them in natural conversation and try to bring in appropriately spiritual things without forcing it. Now, does it always work? No. Sometimes it does. In fact, this is a few years ago. I was sharing something from my heart with my kids and over the dinner table, and I was talking, when we were done, my son looks at me, he was probably 16, he goes, good speech, Dad. Gives me a thumbs up, like winks. I'm like, okay. But you know what? I'm going to keep going because there's a relationship that's there. We're able to have those conversations. Now, in our family, we have one rule. Turn the technology off. Turn it off. I'm not against technology. I love it. Thank God for smartphones and all the things you can do with it. But there's something about talking face to face and no interactions. Turn the technology off. Unless the Lakers are on because you don't want to be legalistic. I'll give you one other example that might help about the family home. So when my son, when he was 14, he wanted to see the movie called Bohemian Rhapsody, which is about the rock band. Oh, now you participate. I see how it is. Rock band Queen. Well, he was 14. It was PG-13. And I didn't love some of the ideas in it, but it was like, okay, we can manage this. His mom was cool with it. So he wanted to see it. And I said, okay, I'll take you and a buddy and spend $100 on tickets and popcorn. If when we're done, you just talk to me about it. I just want to know what you saw and what you think. He goes, sure, Dad. So we go to the movie. We come back, and we sat down at the dinner table, probably 20 or 30 minutes. And all I did is I'd say, hey, what'd you think about the movie? Did anything surprise you? What was your favorite scene? I said, as Christians, were there anything in this movie that we can agree with, we can celebrate? I said, as Christians, is there anything in this movie that gives us pause? Were there any times you felt like the directors were preaching at you where we would disagree with it? And we just talked about it in the home, and that was the opportunity. So you mentioned my book earlier, So the Next Generation Will Know. When I was writing that book with a friend, I was like, if we give parents all these steps to do, they'll do it for a week or two and then, like flossing, stop and feel guilty that they don't do it. And yes, that is a personal confession. I'm great at flossing for a week after I go to the dentist, and then it just fades, and I got to remotivate myself. But what if we could more strategically take advantage of the opportunities that are already there? That's a more effective way to disciple our kids. You're in your home. There's dinner time. Now, the next one, he says, is when you walk along the road. In other words, when you travel. Are there ways to utilize travel time? Now, again, I didn't have formal devotionals with my kids. But one thing I did is I came up with a game, super creative title. I called it the question game. You can tell my sarcasm is coming through. I actually think sarcasm is a spiritual gift, just for the record. I think it's the 6th love language, by the way. Well, so I came up with this game, the question game, when my kids were younger. And we would just ask them questions, age-appropriate questions, and we would like keep score because all our kids are competitive. They get it from my wife. And you don't believe that? Actually, our former head of schools would come to watch us coach 5th grade. He's like, I'm still not sure which of you is more competitive than the other. He goes, I don't come to watch the game. I come to watch you guys coach. I'll leave it there. I got a T one time because the ref told my wife to shut up. I was like, game on. I will go down for that one. Well, anyways, my kids are competitive. So I came up with this game called the question game. We'd ask them spelling questions. We'd ask them math questions, science questions, history questions, age appropriate. But I'd also ask them Bible questions or faith questions. And sometimes I could weave in a little conversation about it. And it's one of the reasons I would do this is when we think of math, it's like there's objective truth. We think of history, there's objective truth. When you think of science, there's objective truth. But then when it shifts to faith, some of us think, well, we're just sharing our feelings. No. 1 John says we know that we have eternal life. We know that. I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I know George Washington's first president of the United States. And I know that Jesus has risen from the grave. And we would just talk with our kids about these things. And sometimes it went great, sometimes it didn't go as planned, but we just try to weave in these conversations, not like a 5-minute drive to the restaurant, but when we had longer drives, we try to weave in and play the question game. I'll never forget when we first started playing, my daughter was like 3. So I'm driving down the road, she's in the car seat right behind me, I can see her in the rearview mirror. So at 3, every spiritual question, the answer has to be Jesus, right? Shauna, who died on the cross? I know, Daddy, Jesus. Shauna, who rose the 3rd day? Who's the Son of God? Jesus. So I decided to mix it up one time. I said, Shauna, it's your turn. Where do we go when we die? She looks me right in the eyes and she goes, jail. We're still working on our theology. Number 3, it says, when you lie down, the end of the day. There's something for a lot of kids where they're open and they're receptive at the end of the day to talk and share that maybe they're not at other times. Sometimes we get frustrated with our kids, but we don't choose the right time to engage them. Maybe kids coming home from school and they're tired. They don't want to talk then. Mom or dad's like excited to see them and they want to talk and it doesn't work. Many kids, their hearts are open and they're just more willing at the end of the day to engage. Well, I've read books with my kids from, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit kind of stuff and Narnia series. But one thing I say to my kids over and over again is I say, you can ask your dad anything. Why? Where are kids going with questions? It's not their pastor. It's not primarily their teacher. It's Google, YouTube, TikTok, artificial intelligence. I want my kids to know I'm not going to shame them. I'm not going to freak out. I'll give them an honest answer. I want to talk with them. So I'll tell my kids all the time that I remember, I'll say, you can ask your dad anything. And I was tucking my son in. He was probably 6 or 7. And I said, hey, buddy, you can ask your dad anything. He goes, okay, Dad, who was Jesus praying to in the garden? I said, what do you mean? He said, Jesus is God, right? I said, yeah. He said, the Father's God, right? I said, yeah. My 6-year-old said, was Jesus praying to himself? I said, go ask your mom. I did my best to explain the Trinity to a 6-year-old. I was at school sometime after that, and this mom came up to me somewhat frantic, and she goes, Mr. McDowell, I've been looking for you. My 2nd grader asked me a question. I don't know the answer. I said, well, what was the question? She said, my 2nd grader asked me, did God love Osama bin Laden? What do I say? I said, oh, that's easy. She said, really? I said, yeah, this one's simple. I said, lean in, I'll tell you. She leaned in, I said, here's what you say to your 2nd grader. What do you think? I'm actually dead serious. A question is almost always better than an answer. Jesus, in the Gospels and Acts, we have recorded 340 questions that Jesus asked. In the letters of Paul, 262 questions. Ask questions. Don't you want to know why a 2nd grader is curious or maybe troubled about who God loves and who God doesn't love? It creates a conversation. What's really interesting is there's some research out of Fuller Theological Seminary. Kara Powell was in charge of a lot of this, and I love it. Now, this was kind of on younger millennials, but I think the truth still stands. The point still stands, is that they said it's not questions and doubt that hijacks a kid's faith. It's unexpressed questions and unexpressed doubts. I think that's right. So if you don't have an answer, that's okay. The best response is not to freak out. not to do what a lot of parents do with kids and go, don't ask that, just read the Bible, and suppress it. Just show that it's okay to have questions. What a great question. Good for you. If you had to venture an answer, what would you say? Let me think about this a little bit and get back to you. Great. It's kind of like I fly a lot. So still, to this day, even though I don't know how many hundreds of flights I've taken, when there's turbulence, it's unsettling. And I always look at like the stewardess. And if the stewardess is doing this number and is like freaked out, that would really make me worried. But they're trained to just be like, I'm fine, don't worry at all. And that like calms you down. When kids ask questions, like, good for you. What a great question. Let's talk about it. Creating a culture that questions are okay and are invited and are good is over half the battle. You know why? Because Christianity is actually true. It's actually true. There's answers if we're willing to seek it. So as you create a culture with your kids, that questions are welcome and are good. Whenever I talk to people who've deconstructed to the point of deconversion, over and over again, my questions were shot down. My questions weren't welcome. People gave me lame, simplistic answers and moved on. Last one Moses says is when you get up. In other words, there's something about the morning. By the way, you're like, wait a minute, you're telling me at night and when I get up, I can't be a night person and a morning person. The point of this is not that you have to do every single one of these, but to pick up some of them that work and intentionally and regularly work them into your rhythm and into your family. That's the point. I'm a morning person. I would much rather do in the morning than I would another time. So my son, I have a son who's in college. I have a daughter who's a high school senior, and I have a son who's 12. And my son who's 12, every morning, get up, make him breakfast, and we've just been reading a section of the Gospel of John together and talking about it. And it's one of the coolest, sweetest things I've ever done with my kids. So reading this morning in John chapter 6, right? There's a section where Jesus walks on the water. And there's just these miracles and these teachings that he makes. And we talk about it sometimes 5 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, just consistently in the morning. I used to get up and go to a local coffee shop near where I live. And I would just work. I didn't have class, so I get there early, work 3-4 hours. And I saw this grandfather with his grandson there one morning. The Bible was open, and they were talking about a Bible story. I came back the next week, grandfather, grandson. Came back the next week, grandfather, grandson. I thought, wow, at least every Wednesday morning when I'm here, this grandfather's taking his grandson out to coffee, spending $5 on a coffee and donut. Actually, it was Starbucks, $8 on a coffee and donut, and just reading the Bible with his grandson and taking him to school. So I sent out a tweet again. I wish I had taken a screenshot of this one. I don't remember how I worded it, but something like, watch this grandfather week after week just mentor his grandson in the scriptures before school over coffee, something like that. And I watched the comments coming in. And one of the comments that jumped out to me was, I wish I had a grandfather like that. I think the heart of this generation, which is the heart of every generation, is to be called the beloved, but by an adult that says, you matter to me. You're important to me. I'm going to lean in and show you how much I love and care for you. That's the heart of this generation. I challenge you sometimes to step back, and rather than being critical on social media, and trust me, I'm critical of a lot on social media, but if you watch a lot of kids, you know what their hearts are saying? Do you see me? Will you like this? Am I important to you? Will you comment? That's really what a lot of it means. In Swahili, hello is sawubona. You know what it means? It means, I see you. Isn't that powerful? I see you. I see you. That's like the heart for somebody to just see us for who we truly are. We're going to shift to questions in just a minute, but let me take a step back Because I realize some of you might be like, I wish I had heard this a long time ago. My kids might have turned out differently. Or, you know what, Sean, I've done this. This is old news to me, and it didn't work. Now what do I do? Well, if that's where you're at, can I tell you, first off, you're not alone. I get almost daily emails that are just heartbreaking. I can't even respond to all of them. Parents, grandparents just torn up about the decisions their kids are making. You're not alone. Second, God's heart is more broken than your heart or my heart could ever be. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. He wept over Jerusalem. But third, maybe today is an encouragement to not give up, to take baby steps to rekindle that relationship as best as you can. Maybe today is an encouragement to do this. If I was going to sum everything up in like a tweet, what is the would you say, or a tattoo? Is that what you said? I would love to. I will come back for free if you tattoo this on you, Mr. G. For free. All right? Just. Forehead. You're just going to have to put my website below it. No, I'm kidding. Free advertising. Look at this guy. If you're going to sum it up in a tweet or a tattoo, what the data shows to pass on our faith, there's no guarantee because people have what's called free will. But there's really three things that it boils down to. Number one, we have to model a faith that our kids find attractive. Not perfect, but they look at us, our lives, and our relationships and our marriages and say, I want that. You got to model it, number one. Number two, build relationships with your kids. Intimate, close relationships with your kids. And third, have spiritual conversations in the rhythm of life about how to think biblically about different issues that arise. That's what the scriptures say, and guess what? That's what the data shows. We have time for some questions. I'm really curious what questions are going to come in after pie, now at number 2 or number 3, whatever it is. But I would love to, well, you can take it away. Tell us what steps to get best to taking some questions.
Yeah, incredible stuff, Sean. And we want to give you an opportunity, since we have him here, to ask questions. So we're going to put that QR code on the screen again. But if you open your phone, you should still have it on there. But if not, scan that QR code one more time. Earlier, we kind of navigated that together, and you guys filled out some polls. This time, we're going to be on the Q&A tab, which is towards the left. And you can submit a question there. And not only, if you don't have a question, you could look at the other questions on that list. And if there's one you're like, oh, I would love to hear the answer to that, you can actually vote and like it, kind of like social media, right?
Exactly.
We want to see you. We want to see your question. So if you have one where you're like, oh, I would love to hear from Sean, go ahead and vote and like it. And we'll try to hit those questions if you can. So, Sean.
And you can vote on how many of you really want him to get that tattoo.
Yeah, if anyone wants to put a question like that. Here's one, Sean, that came in. It's got several votes. It says, what are a few resources that you might recommend to help navigate culture today? His books.
To navigate culture. I'll come back to my books at the end, but if the question is navigating culture, I guess two podcasts. One is the Colson Center with John Stonestreet. How many of you recognize the Colson Center? By show of hands, the Colson Center. Okay, a few of you do. That is my go-to resource on navigating culture, hands down. John Stonestreet is a friend of mine, co-author of mine. He has daily updates, like he does these sometimes 1 minute, sometimes 5 minute quick videos, and they're also audio you can listen to on podcast. Every Friday has an hour-long cultural update where they take stories in the news and talk about the worldview that's behind it. Our podcast, Think Biblically, we do a main episode every Tuesday where we interview an author, and then we do a weekly cultural update on Friday. So we have one we recorded today, we're posting tomorrow. So as far as navigating culture, Think Biblically podcast, Breakpoint by the Colson Center are my two go-tos. We also were talking at dinner about Access. They have a great weekly or bi-weekly email that they send out called, what was the name of it again?
It's called Culture Translator.
That's right, Culture Translator. It's really, really helpful and is one of my go-to resources on cultural navigation. So those are three. I'll come back to the books, but those are resources that I would recommend on that question.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe as a school, we can stay in tune with some of those things. In fact, parents, I don't know if you know this, but yeah, Parent University is a night where we, meet annually. But on our website, we actually have a Parent University page. And if you log on there or go on our website and go there under Current Families, you'll see Parent University. And there's actually some links to some of those resources, like Access Group. And that can take you to conversation kits. So like some of the things you've been talking about tonight, those daily rhythms of questions and asking your kids things. They have tons of resources on that. So look for that, parents, because that might be an opportunity for you to look at. So that's good. Okay, this is a popular one. Has 9 votes. Can you recommend any more guiding questions that might help spark conversations with my kids?
So, I would say 2 things. One of the skills that I think about a lot is the skill of asking good questions. It's not just ask these 3 questions. It's become a person who asks thoughtful, good questions. It's a skill to develop, like cooking or something else. And by the way, I have minimal skills in that department, but I watch people who ask good questions. I'm oftentimes observing, that was a thoughtful question. Where did that come from? Jesus, again, asked questions. Next time you read the Bible, think, why did he ask this question? Why here and not there? So I would just invite you to maybe you already think this way, to become the kind of person who's better at asking questions. So on my YouTube channel, I interview people. So I never really thought of this until 4 years ago. I used to be the one who was interviewed. Now that I interview people, I'm always trying to think of what's a good question that would unlock a conversation and an insight. So that skill is more important than any particular question I could give you. But here's one specific one that might help. Don't ask your kids what they think. Ask them how they feel. Don't ask your kids, what do you think about this? Say, how did that make you feel? Now, in the classroom, for me, one thing that I noticed with high school students is I'd ask them a question, they'd say, I feel this, and I'd say, you know what? I really care about your feelings, but I want to know what you think. Because we're wrestling with ideas. But when I want my kids to share and open up and start a conversation, oftentimes it's, hey Shane, hey Shauna, I'm curious. I saw this happen. How'd that make you feel? Tell me about it. I think you'd be amazed that that's more likely to create a conversation than purely on a cerebral level.
That's good. All right, with 4 votes, how do you use your kids' interests, like movies or shows or video games, to create questions that encourage a God-centered or kingdom mindset for them?
How do you use these things? Well, one thing is you've got to do it or watch it with your kids. That's what helps a lot. So, I don't love playing video games unless it's Miss Pac-Man, to be honest. That's my all-time favorite game. I don't play a lot of video games, but now and then I'll just play with my kids to open up conversations, understand what's going on, step into their world. Then they're more likely to talk with me about it if I don't. Whenever I'm in the car, like my son, 12-year-old, always wants to play music, and I'm like, some of the music, I don't tell him this. I'm like, I really don't want to hear this. But I'm like, you know what? Oh, yeah, play the song. Tell me why you like this song. Where'd you first hear this song? And that creates a conversation because I listen to it. The movies that my kids want to watch, with appropriate boundaries, of course, watch it with them and engage it gives you a chance to have those conversations with them. I'm trying to think of a resource that would help with this. Oh gosh, there's no specific one that's coming to mind. I mean, Access's update has a lot of good updates on this.
One, Sean, like especially with movie, because you're talking about appropriate levels and things like that. I know a lot of our families have used, maybe you've used it before, but even like Common Sense Media. You heard it. It's not a biblical, it's not a biblical platform, but it is a good place maybe for people to start if they're not sure if a movie is appropriate. But I think sitting down with them is important. I remember when phones became, more and more popular, and when I was in the classroom, one thing the kids would say is, sometimes I wish my parents would watch it with me and not have their phone too, because how earlier you were talking about, what the kids are interested in their passions and things like that. But they want to see their parent engaged also with what they're interested in, right? And then if we're not watching it, we don't know what questions to ask, or we might miss a part.
Right.
Yeah, so there's maybe some encouragement with that.
My big encouragement is to keep it positive. Keep it positive. Now, for me, I used to teach it was one of my favorite to teach on like how to biblically understand film. So like Brian Godawa has a book, it's from 2009, but the principles of time was called Hollywood Worldviews. When I read that, I'm like, oh my goodness, it kind of changed the way that I watch movies, because there's certain themes that always come up, like universal themes of the villain and the good guy and the character flaw and, the climax of the film. And so I love that. If you're interested in going for that movie, that book, Hollywood Worldviews, was one of my favorites. I would say keep it positive. As parents, the older I get, the more I can be like critical of things. I don't want my son to watch this. I don't want my daughter watching this. But I found that can shut down conversation. Now, there is a time to be critical, for sure. But I think that can quickly shut down conversation and not invite our kids to talk more. And so just ask questions. Hey, what do you enjoy about this movie? Are there any biblical themes in this movie? Can you think of any stories in the Bible that overlap with this story that's here? Bottom line, be a person who's curious and have a conversation. Curiosity really drives asking good questions and engaging our kids.
Yeah, that's good. One time I heard a parent say, like, to their child, like, hey, you can land softly with me, for a kid to know that. It's kind of what you're saying. It's pretty awesome. Here's one that's been there, has several votes. Do you have any recommendations of how to go through like a theology or values book with your teen? For example, do you recommend one chapter a week, or how do you approach that kind of chat?
That question is like gravy to my heart, for lack of a better metaphor. I love that you're asking that, and that's your desire with a teenager. I wish more parents were asking that. So it's funny, I wrote a book in 2005 called Ethics, ETHIX. And 2005, 20 years ago, I think my son was 1 year old. So I had 10 chapters in the book, because books have 10 chapters. Like, I had no more thoughtfulness than that at that stage. I updated it recently. I'm like, wait a minute, these chapters are way too long. What would I, as a parent, use? So I made it 25 chapters, but shorter, like 4 to 5 pages that you can read in like 5 minutes or out loud. So I wouldn't overdo it. Don't shoot for the moon. And kids will respond differently. So my son would go to the movie and talk to me about it. My older son, but he wouldn't read a book with me. But my younger son will. My daughter, I took a book and I gave it to her. I said, hey, if you'll read this and just go to coffee with me for an hour and a half and talk about it, I'll buy you a pair of shoes. She goes, there's an outlet down the street. I could get 2 for the price of 1. Is that okay? I said, you can get 3 for the price of 1 if you can find a good deal. And that worked for her. So we've got to find ways to just engage our kids. Some will respond differently. But I didn't bring it tonight. I wrote a book called Chasing Love, Sex, Love, and Relationships in a Confused Culture. And I just basically wrote it for my own kids, and I couldn't find any biblically based, interesting books that countered some of the lies in our culture on issues of sexuality. Short chapters. And I can't tell you how many people have told me, hey, I just read this with my son or my daughter once a week or 2 nights a week, and we just talk about it. That is the best way to do it. So that book, Chasing Love, might help if you're looking for one on sex, love, and relationships. But find a plan that works for your unique kid and tailor it to them.
Yeah, that's good. You were talking about, kids responding differently and things like this. So this is kind of in that light.
Okay.
What are your recommendations for connecting with a kid who is wired very differently than you?
So I have 2 kids that are wired very differently than me. And I have one that's wired similarly to me. One thing to do is to ask your spouse, hey, what do you think about the way we connect? And what do you think I could do better? Now, that can be a dangerous question because he or she will probably see your blind spots better than you have. But if you really care, no one's more vested. Nobody knows you and your kid better than your spouse. Just ask them. The other way is just observe your kid, right? I mean, when are they best willing to talk? How do they spend their time? What are they interested in? And just tailor and do what's important to them. The other thing you can do, my dad did this sometimes, is just ask your kid, just say, you know what? Well, how would you, like if you were going to give me feedback as a parent? Now you got to brace yourself. Who knows what they'll say? What feedback would you give me? I'm curious. I'm not a perfect parent. I made mistakes. But you and I have some differences, and I want to be a parent to you. God has made you unique and different. And sometimes you just think differently than I do, and I feel like I don't always respond the best way that I could. How could I better parent you? How could we spend time together more meaningfully? And mean it. And listen. And make changes if you have to. I've had those conversations with my kids. Sometimes they go well, sometimes it's like, okay, deep breath. Got to work on this. I think that's what I would do.
Yeah, that's good. And those are, like you said, hard to ask. But at Foothill, we often tell our students, hey, feedback's a gift, right? It can teach a lot, and it can be a tough gift to unwrap,
Yes,
but it's a gift.
It definitely can.
Do you have time for about 2 more questions,
yeah, go
Sean?
ahead, as
Okay.
long as it's helpful.
This has gotten a lot of votes. It says, what does your personal mission statement look like for your home? And how does that differ from when you first became a parent? Like, has it evolved?
I don't think it's changed. Mm-hmm. Here's my heart for my kids. That they would follow the Lord and use their gifts to advance his kingdom. My kids would know and love the Lord and just use their gifts, whatever they may be, in a range of different ways to advance the kingdom of God. That's what I remember my parents about me. My dad never was like, you should be an author. You should speak like me. He never said that, which was wise for a lot of reasons. My stubbornness might have gone the other direction. Who knows? But I just remember the narrative of like, son, God has given you gifts. And use those gifts. I had a season where I was thinking about going into politics. I had a season I was thinking about coaching. And it was like, you just be the best coach or best politician for the Lord that you could be. That's my heart for my kids, and I don't think that's changed.
Yeah, it's good. You've been talking, this whole night has been about passing our faith to the next generation, and this can be a reality. And I think we'll end with this. Is that okay, Sean?
Sure.
And then I want to make a few announcements and give time for, I know you have some books that you want to share. It says, how do you handle or navigate when your child, in a sense, has left the faith or has told you, hey, they don't believe in God anymore? So how would you respond if your child said that to you?
Well, I actually almost said that to my dad. What I mean by almost is when I was, I think, 19, I sat down with my dad. We're in Breckenridge, Colorado, and he's this great Christian apologist, speaker, defender of the faith. And I said, Dad, I want to know what's true, but I'm not sure that I'm convinced Christianity is true. I'll never forget his response. He looked at me and goes, "Son, I think that's great." And I said, "Did you hear anything that I just said?" He goes, "Son, you can't live on my convictions. You've got to decide for yourself if you really think Christianity is true." He said something interesting. He said, "Only walk away what you've learned growing up if you're convinced that it's not true." He said, "If you seek after truth, I'm confident you'll keep following Jesus because Jesus is the truth. But your mom and I love you no matter what." That's exactly what I needed to hear. So if you have kids that are there, don't blame yourself. Give yourself grace. None of us are perfect parents. There's only one person who would have been a perfect parent, but despite what the Da Vinci Code said, he didn't have kids. Give yourself some grace. And I would say play the longer term game. Chances are, if you're here tonight, you've been in a church, you send your kids to a Christian school, they know what you believe. So you don't have to feel like every single conversation I've got to sneak in evidence for the resurrection. I got to prove the Bible's true. Don't feel the need to do that. In fact, as hard as it is, I'd invite you to have a conversation and just say, "Can we get some coffee? You told me you don't believe anymore. All I want to do is hear you out and understand where you're at and why as a parent and how I can love you in this season." And you can say, "To be honest with you, it's painful to me that you don't believe. I'd be lying if I didn't say that. It's painful. But I'm going to love you no matter what. And I want to understand when you first started having questions. Help me understand how you see the world. Help me understand how you think I could best love you. I might differ, but I just want to understand." That shows a lot of humility. That invites further conversation, and I think is playing a wise long game. I assess a lot of my conversations based on what people say, in the sense that when I'm having a spiritual conversation with somebody, I'm asking, is this person really open, or is their mind closed? So a friend of mine recently, his son just became a Mormon kind of out of nowhere. And of course, the reason is because he met a girl. That's exactly right. Exactly right. 100%. You've heard this story before. And where was I going with this?
It's always
Darn
the girl.
it, Chris. And so he called me. He's like, "You got to talk to my son." I'm like, "Okay." So I reached out, talked to them. And I very quickly figured out he's not open. His heart is set. And I said, "You know what? It sounds to me like your mind is made up and you're not open to changing." I said, "I love you. I will always love you. If you reach a point where you're open and want to have this conversation, I hope I'll be the first person that you call. I'm not going to force that if he's not open." Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away. So in part, it'll just give you a sense of where your kids are at and how open they are and their willingness to hear and how they view you. That information would be valuable. I would encourage you to try to have that conversation if you can. By the way, I don't know, I wrote a book. I don't know if they would read or not, but one of the books that's back there that's only $5, which is cheaper than coffee at Starbucks, just for a record. It's actually cheaper than my cost. It's called Set Adrift, Deconstructing What You Believe Without Sinking Your Faith. So it's for a kid who's going, "I don't really know what I believe." It's kind of the book I wish somebody gave me 20 years ago, and I was like, "I'm trying to figure this out. I have questions. I don't know where to land." That's who I wrote it for. Now, you can't force a kid to read something if they're not open to it, right? That might not be helpful. But if it's like, "Hey, I know you're trying to make sense of what you believe and why. Here's a book. If you get a chance to read it and just tell me what you think about it, I'd love to have a conversation with you." Some kids would do it, some wouldn't. But that's the book, Set Adrift, that's back there. The talk tonight is basically the book so the next generation will know. This is not like a why book, it's a how book. So I tried to give you some practical things tonight. If you're like, I want some more practical principles with my kids, the book So the Next Generation Will Know is back there. That one's also significantly marked down. And then a recent book I wrote with my dad called The 12 Crucial Truths of the Christian Faith. If we're going to pass on our faith, we actually have to know with confidence what our faith is. So what are the essentials of the Christian faith? How do we know these are actually true? And then how do we live them out in a relationship? That's the heart of 12 Crucial Truths that's back there. I'm happy to take more, but I'm guessing we're bumping up against the time.
Yeah, so Sean actually has a table in the back with some books and things like that. Before we do, though, I also have an announcement, but can we give a round of applause to Sean, and thank you for being here. We actually, yes, we have a gift for you, some Foothill swag.
Wow,
and so hopefully you can take.
Let's
we're
go.
passing the Foothill culture to the next generation.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can
Look
just.
at this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being
Fun.
here. And parents, real quick, before you head to that table, though, the school actually purchased some of those books. And we put some business cards around underneath the seats of some of the seats here. And there's some empty seats, so those are fair game, no fighting. But go ahead and look under the seat. If you have a business card, we'd actually, is it my business card? Oh, okay. Then we'll provide a book for you tonight. So
How are you?
there should be some, but
Give me 1
Yeah.
second. Check. Oh, he turned me off.
Any
There.
winners?
How are you?
No winners
Is
yet?
that Georgia? You
Oh,
got
over here
going
in the
on
back. All right. Oh, you got
Oh, is
one.
it
All
really?
right. Cool.
there?
So if you get
Oh, nice.
there's still some empty chairs, but if you have a business card, meet us
Okay.
in the back, and we'd like to get you a book. But parents, thank you so much for coming.
good.
We're so appreciative of you,
pastor.
and thank you for coming tonight. Feel free to grab a book, but you're dismissed. So.